Everyone in Crescent Falls believed Caleb Voss had died years ago. I believed it too. His grave sat under a bent oak in St. Michael's Cemetery. His death certificate was filed in the county office. Hundreds of people had stood in black clothes at his funeral and prayed for his soul. So when I opened a dusty parish ledger one ordinary afternoon and saw one tiny detail that matched the handwriting of a man who was supposed to be dead, my blood went cold. In that moment, I knew the dead man might never have died at all. By the end of my story, you will understand why the greatest mistake people made was believing that closing a case meant the truth had finally been found. To understand why one tiny detail changed everything I believed, I have to take you back to the quiet life I lived before I ever imagined I would reopen the worst mystery Crescent Falls had ever known. I was Sister Margaret, and I lived at St. Agnes Convent on the edge of town. My days were simple, and I loved them that way. I prayed before sunrise. I helped in the kitchen. I brought soup, blankets, and food vouchers to local families who were barely holding on, and when my hands were free, I worked in the parish archives. Old records calmed me. I liked faded ink, cracked leather binders, and the way a forgotten date could still tell the truth. I had spent enough years around paper to believe something I still believe now, which is that every mystery leaves behind one forgotten clue, even when people try their hardest to bury it. Crescent Falls looked peaceful by then, but it had not always been that way. Years earlier, the town had been shaken by a string of terrible crimes. People disappeared. Families locked their doors before dark. Mothers walked children to school in pairs. Men stopped meeting at the diner after sunset. Every fear in town eventually pointed to Caleb Voss, a mechanic with quiet eyes and a voice nobody trusted. Then, one stormy night, his truck went off Alder Bridge and burned so badly that the town accepted the ending it wanted most. Caleb Voss was declared dead. There was a grave, a death certificate, and a funeral so full that people had to stand in the church aisles. After that, most folks stopped talking. Silence felt easier than memory. I did too, for a long time. Then, one afternoon years later, I was sorting memorial envelopes in the records room when I found a request slip tucked between two old parish receipts. It was so ordinary that I almost threw it away. The name written at the top was Daniel Mercer, a man I knew only as a quiet handyman who helped with repairs around the convent. But it was the handwriting that stopped me. The capital C curved the same way Caleb Voss had always curved his C. The T crossed the same sharp way. The final S had the same ugly little loop at the bottom, like the writer had made the letter twice and never fully trusted either version. I had seen that hand before, years earlier, in an anonymous confession letter filed away in the archives after the crimes ended. I sat there staring at that slip, and I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe Daniel Mercer had copied the style. Maybe I was tired. Maybe grief had made me suspicious of everything. But I pulled the old confession letter anyway, the one Father Thomas had tucked into a box after receiving it from a victim's family. I laid the two pages side by side. Same hand, same pressure in the ink, same strange habit of underlining names twice. My pulse started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I did not run to the police right away. I wish I could say I did, but I did not. I wanted proof, not fear. So I searched the burial records next. That is when the story began to crack. The death certificate for Caleb Voss looked official enough at first glance, but the supporting papers were weak. There was no proper autopsy attached. The body had been identified by a wallet, a ring, and a hurried statement from the coroner after the River Road crash. The funeral home ledger described the remains as unidentified male from Alder Bridge accident before the name Caleb Voss was ever written in. That should not have happened. Not for a man whose grave the whole town had mourned. I took the records to Deputy Lauren Pike, who had inherited the case years after everyone else had moved on. She listened, but I could tell she was holding back her disbelief. I remember her saying, gently but firmly, that dead men did not usually climb out of graves just because a nun found a messy signature. I did not blame her. I would have sounded unhinged too if I had heard myself from the outside. So I kept going. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the funeral, the closed casket, the way nobody had been allowed to see the body. I remembered the rushed prayers. I remembered how quickly people had wanted the nightmare to end. The next afternoon, I visited Mrs. Helen Ward, a retired librarian who had spent years helping the town sort old newspaper archives. She was one of the few people who still spoke about the old crimes without flinching. When I showed her the handwriting, she went pale. She told me she had seen Caleb Voss sign an insurance form years earlier and that the odd tilt of the letters had always bothered her. Then she added something I will never forget. She said the man at the funeral had not had Caleb's chin scar. That detail hit me harder than anything else. Caleb had always had a small scar along his jaw from a childhood accident. The town had seen it for years. If the body in the coffin did not have that scar, then someone had either made a mistake or made a plan. A week later, I received an envelope slipped under the convent door, no return address. Inside was one line written in block letters: "Let the dead stay buried, sister." I remember standing in the hallway with that paper shaking in my hand. That was the moment I finally understood I was being watched. And it was also the moment I asked myself the question that haunted me for the rest of the investigation. Was I uncovering the truth, or was I about to destroy innocent lives by chasing a shadow? The answer came from an abandoned house on Briar Lane. I found the address by tracing an old property transfer in the county ledger. The house had been empty for years, or so people said. The deed had changed hands right after Caleb Voss's funeral. The buyer's name was Daniel Mercer. That alone made my skin crawl. Deputy Pike agreed to go with me, and inside the attic we found a locked tin box hidden behind loose boards. I still remember the smell of dust and old wood when we opened it. Inside was a diary, 3 altered identity documents, and a black and white photograph of Caleb Voss standing beside that same house 3 months after his supposed death. He looked thinner, older, and clean-shaven, but I knew his face immediately. On the back of the photo, in the same hand as the request slip, he had written, "They buried the wrong story." My knees nearly gave out. The diary made everything worse. Page after page, Caleb described the crash on Alder Bridge as a performance. He wrote about burning a truck that was not his, using another man's wallet, and letting the town believe the body belonged to him because nobody wanted to ask too many questions. He wrote that the county would accept a death certificate faster than it would accept humiliation. He wrote that after the funeral, he had taken the name Daniel Mercer and lived in plain sight because ordinary people never look twice at someone who keeps their head down and pays his bills on time. Then I found the line that changed the case from history into danger. He wrote that he had been watching the families for years, waiting until they stopped asking questions, and that a young widow who worked at the library had started asking too many of them again. I am not ashamed to say my stomach turned. This was no longer about old paper. This was about a living man with a second name, a hidden past, and unfinished intentions. And if he had fooled the town once, he could do it again. I went straight to the library widow, a gentlewoman named Ruth Vale, who had lost her husband in one of the early crimes. She had been combing through microfilm because she could not let her brother's name disappear into the town's silence. When I told her she needed to be careful, she started crying before I even finished speaking. She said Daniel Mercer had been helping her carry boxes, had asked too many questions, had quietly offered to fix her porch lock. She had thought he was simply kind. Hearing that nearly broke me because I knew exactly what kind of kindness a man like that could wear. Deputy Pike finally believed me when the county lab matched the fingerprints from Daniel Mercer's lease papers and bank forms to prints in Caleb Voss's original arrest file, which had been sealed but never destroyed. Then the retired coroner came forward. He was shaking when he spoke, and he admitted he had signed Caleb's death certificate too quickly after the river crash because the scene was chaos and everyone wanted the case finished. He also admitted the body had never been properly identified. The grave had become convenient. The truth had become optional. That was the moment the investigation finally tipped. The sheriff reopened the case. A warrant was issued, and while the town was still arguing over whether I had lost my mind, officers were already waiting for Daniel Mercer to return to his rented room above the feed store. He came back that evening with a suitcase and a cash withdrawal receipt in his pocket. He looked tired, not shocked. That is what I remember most. He looked like a man who had spent years believing he was untouchable. When the sheriff called his name, he froze. When they showed him the diary, the photograph, the fingerprints, and the burial records, the color drained from his face. He denied everything for less than a minute. Then he saw me standing there, and something in his eyes changed. It was not rage. It was not fear. It was the cold, flat look of a man realizing the story had finally caught up to him. He confessed in pieces because people like him rarely confess cleanly. He admitted Caleb Voss had staged the crash, used another dead man's remains to fake his own death, and built a new life under the name Daniel Mercer. He admitted he had stayed in Crescent Falls because he knew the town would never imagine the monster was still walking the same streets. He admitted he had spent years listening, watching, and choosing who to trust. He did not get to choose the ending. The law did. The district prosecutor confirmed his identity through the records, the prints, the diary, and the testimony from the coroner. The charges moved forward. The victims' families finally got the answers they had been denied for so long, and I watched grief change shape in their faces. It did not disappear. Nothing like that ever disappears, but it became real in a new way because now they knew who to name. As for Ruth Vale, we got to her in time. She was safe, and I still thank God for that every day. She told me later that she had started feeling like someone was following her, but she had been afraid to seem dramatic. I told her fear is not drama. Fear is often the body's way of noticing truth before the mind is ready. After that, I thought the hardest part would be over. I was wrong. The hardest part came in the quiet afterward, when the headlines faded and the town had to live with what had been buried in plain sight. I felt relief, but I also felt exhausted in a way sleep could not fix. I felt sadness for every family that had spent years carrying the wrong story. I felt humility too, because I knew I had not solved anything by being brilliant. I solved it because I paid attention to one tiny detail and refused to let it go. That taught me more about faith than any sermon ever had. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is opening one more folder, asking one more question, and trusting that truth is still worth the trouble. And I will tell you something else. I used to believe justice was mostly about punishment. Now I believe it is also about memory. It is about refusing to let lies have the last word. It is about giving grieving people the dignity of an honest answer. It is about understanding that a grave, a certificate, and a funeral can all exist, and still the truth can be standing somewhere else, hidden in plain sight. Truth does not disappear just because people stop searching for it. Sometimes justice waits patiently until one ordinary person notices what everyone else overlooked. That is what happened to me in Crescent Falls. One impossible detail led me to a grave that should never have been trusted, a death that had been staged, and a killer who had lived among us under another name for years. So tell me in the comments, would you have reopened a case everyone believed was already solved? And if this final revelation changed everything you thought you knew, please share this story because some truths only survive when we are willing to pass them on.